Well, these couple of weeks have been filled with some real ups and downs, that's for sure. And if you haven't guessed it from the video title, I've decided to open up my very own micro bakery. I'm going to use the experience that I gained as a chef working in commercial and private kitchens, and I'm going to combine it with what I've learned baking bread to produce my very own products for the public. Now, this is going to start life as this tiny micro bakery, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't have real ideas for potential scaling. Now, I want to take you along on that journey with me to share in the highs and of course the lows. And speaking of lows, I've already hit one big problem, which looks like it could jeopardize my plans really before I've begun, but you'll find out more about that shortly. Now, by joining me on this journey, you're going to learn how I plan on running this out of my home with super limited space. You'll see if it's even possible to bake multiple loaves of sourdough in this tiny domestic oven. I'm going to share how I design, test, scale and cost the recipe formulas. You'll discover the wireless system I'm going to use to control the entire fermentation and proving. And of course my strategy for shifting these loaves without any kind of storefront or commercial presence. In other words, I'm completely unknown. Now, we've got some damn good bakeries in my local area, so I've got no idea if this is even possible, but I would rather give something a damn good shot than sit around dreaming. Right, so the first thing that I needed to do was scale up a recipe, and that was to see if my oven could even handle baking 4 doughs all at once, all uncovered. And as you'll see, well, it was pretty interesting. Now, all of my formulas, they're going to be designed using Magnus, our community sourdough calculator. I've got a free, simpler version of this available in the video description, and I've used that exact version to design, well, most of my sourdough recipes. Now, I'm still shortlisting the products that I'm going to test for the micro bakery. For sure, I'm going to offer a classic sourdough loaf, some kind of soft sandwich loaf, baguettes, Detroit style pizza, but I need more ideas. So if you've got any thoughts, let me know down below. Now, there's no way I can move forward with this project without including my old faithful sourdough recipe, and that is exactly what I chose for a dummy run through, just to identify the holes within my operation, of which there are plenty. Now, my standard formula produces an 800 gram dough, so I simply increased the scale to 4 and voila, I was ready to go. Right, so during mixing, I encountered, well, my first problems. This is my largest mixing bowl, and I've only added half the flour here. My trusty spoon, well, that was useless, so I needed to employ a Dutch whisk to help me out mixing. Now, I did manage to pull this dough together, everything was fine, but it did beg the question, do I need a mechanical mixer, or can I actually manage larger quantities or larger mixes by hand without killing myself? I don't know, what do you think? Are there even any decent mixers that aren't going to take up all of my counter space? Now, I needed to think carefully about the container that I use to bulk ferment the dough, because I want to fit several of them inside my fermentation fridge. So I've opted for this, well, shallow, low profile plastic container. And the good thing is I can fit 6 of these into one fermentation chamber, which gives me a total of 24 800 gram doughs. That's going to be more than enough to get started with. But I am worried about the resting stage after pre-shaping. My kitchen's super tiny, it has no air conditioning, and in the summer it gets filthy hot. So the baking flow that I set up now, it needs to be Greek summer-proof. So I've cut some marine ply to fit into my chamber so the dough can rest in a temperature-controlled space. Now, this might be overkill, but we'll see as we move on. Now, as you can see, space is super tight for me, and even if I work methodically, I just need more counter space. So if I can get my wife, Vicky, to sign off on it, I'm going to transform our utility/dumping ground into a workstation for the micro bakery. My fermentation chamber, well, that's already in there, which means that I'll be able to keep most of the micro bakery completely separate from my home and my kitchen. Now, that brings me on to the next point. After shaping and an ambient proof, I was able to squeeze these 4 baskets onto the bottom of our kitchen fridge. Now, this just isn't ideal, but luckily I've got a spare freezer in my utility room. So that's now earmarked for converting into another prover/retarder. And that's going to give me 2 temperature controlled spaces. Now, baking volume in a domestic oven, in this tiny domestic oven, is the bottleneck of this entire micro bakery, and you're about to see the problems that I face. And to make things worse, I hadn't proved the dough perfectly, so To be fair, I wasn't expecting miracles. Now I set my oven up, I placed the baking steel in the centre of the oven, then I placed my baking stone on the bottom. I used a little espresso pot as a steam pod. I then preheated everything, the oven, the steel, the stone and the steamer pod to 220 degrees Celsius. I scored my dough, slipped it in, put some boiling water in the steamer pod, closed the door. I then dropped the temperature to 200 degrees Celsius for the first 20 minutes of baking, then I wound the temperature back up to 220 degrees Celsius for the final part of the baking. Now this is the biggest hurdle. I need enough heat for the loaves to spring, but I don't want too much heat coming from that top element because it's going to set the top of the loaves before they've sprung properly. So this balance of temperature and steam is critical if I'm going to be able to use this oven for the micro bakery. And well, things didn't go to plan. Now these loaves were rotated during baking. So the bottom two loaves started baking on the top. And as you can see, they've actually benefited from the steam pod being in the top chamber. They've sprung a little, but of course I was hoping for more. The ones on the top, which were originally on the bottom during the first part of baking, well, they lack a lot of spring. They didn't have a steam pod in their baking zone, and it shows. But it's good to have that comparison. Now, of course, this coupled with the substandard proof has, well, produced substandard loaves. But I don't think all was lost. In fact, I think it was a great first bake. I discovered areas where I lacked the right equipment for the right job, and I learned how I could create a proper baking method or baking flow to cope with larger volumes. But critically, I'm still not sure if my oven is going to be enough to get this bakery off the starting line. And if it's not, I don't even think I could fit a commercial oven into my space. Well, I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens over the coming weeks. Don't forget to let me know if you've got any tips for dough mixers and of course to share your ideas for what loaves I could be baking. Stay tuned to keep up to speed with my new micro bakery and I'll see you again very soon.